Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Now, over the course of the last month, we've talked about a multitude of fantasy football draft strategies that you guys can utilize for your upcoming 2023 leagues. So what I wanted to go ahead and accomplish on today's video is congregating all of that information in regards to the different videos and all the different statistics that I've displayed over the course of this last month, congregate that into one singular video and give you guys the macro perspective as to how I navigate my 2023 fantasy football drafts in order to find success, while additionally giving you guys the micro details in regards to statistics that I've gathered over the course of the last decade of fantasy football in order to lead to our potential success in 2023. That's the entire concept of today's episode, giving you guys as much details as possible. So before your upcoming 2023 fantasy football drafts take place this upcoming weekend, you're equipped with all the information possible to make the most informed decisions on the selections that you make. Now, majority of the concepts and details that I'm going to cover over the course of today's episode are in my 2023 fantasy football draft guide, like you guys can see on screen, but there's so much more details in regards to what is involved in my methodology in drafting the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end positions that are not going to be mentioned over the course of today's video, along with my 2023 fantasy football draft rankings, which encompasses everything from by position, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defense, along with top 200 flex at a half PPR, full PPR scoring format, 4-point per passing touchdown, 6-point per passing touchdown. All of that available in order to give you guys an advantage upon your upcoming drafts. Now, for those of you who are interested in taking advantage of what my draft guide has to offer going into this season, be sure to go ahead and travel down to the description of the video and click on the link traveling over to Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, all you have to do is use code Andrew to sign up and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. After doing so, you're not only going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, you're additionally going to get my 2023 fantasy football draft guide, the rankings that are included there. Those rankings will be updated this upcoming Saturday morning at 5 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, maybe even earlier, depending on when I get all of the information regarding all the cuts, all the PUP players going into the 2023 season, all of that updated so that we can give you guys as many advantages possible going into your 2023 fantasy football drafts this upcoming weekend. So go ahead and take advantage of that today. Now, the rankings don't just end on Saturday. As for the remainder of the 2023 fantasy football season, I will send you individual weekly rankings from weeks 1 through 18, my email personally to yours, so that you are equipped with rankings for every single Sunday morning, half PPR, full PPR, by position, by tier, so that you are making the most informed decisions for the 2023 season so we can help you capture a fantasy football championship. So for those of you who are interested, be sure to check out your eligibility, of course, determined on the right side of the screen based on where you're located. Take advantage of the opportunity to draft via Underdog today and draft responsibly. For those of you who are not eligible based on your current location, or potentially you've signed up via Underdog Fantasy before, you can also check out the Patreon. The link is down in the description for similar services. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Last thing I wanted to mention before we get into talking about the macro perspective of all things fantasy football related regarding draft strategies for the 2023 season. Of course, my official 2023 fantasy football merchandise line, the 1.01 brand, is available today. As you guys can see, I'm currently wearing the Champion branded tie-dye hoodie, again with greetings and salutations on the chest. So for those of you who are interested, travel over to andrewkiorkofshop.com, link down in the description of the video, to go ahead, check out the different merchandise that is available and support the 1.01 brand and the fantasy football efforts of myself. Thank you very much. All right, so let's go ahead and let's talk about the different methodologies as to how I approach my 2023 fantasy football drafts based on the different positions. I want to begin by talking about the quarterback position in specific, primarily because a lot of questions that I have seen in regards to the last couple of days that we've conducted live streams. The last 3 days, we've been here around 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time live streaming. The entire concept has been, Andrew, is it too early to select one of these quarterbacks, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, or Jalen Hurts, within the second round of my draft? And oftentimes I'm thinking to myself, yes, it is a bit early to go ahead and conduct the draft and where you're selecting a quarterback, especially in a 4-point per passing touchdown league that early. But I want to go ahead and just kind of conceptualize the idea as to where you guys are typically finding these quarterbacks available and where they're typically being taken based on different overall platforms and where you draft. Currently via ESPN, the ADP of Patrick Mahomes is in the beginning of the second round. While if you go to Yahoo, very similar. On Sleeper, it's obviously the same as well. And via Underdog Fantasy, it's sitting about 21, which is at the back end of the second round, which is significantly better in terms of the overall investment that you're making in regards to the quarterback position and what you're getting in return. I've often said this in the past, and I'll repeat myself. Selecting a quarterback in a 4-point per passing touchdown format anywhere in the first round or even in the beginning or middle of the second round is a mistake. At very best, the earliest you should be selecting a quarterback is at the very end of the second round, because you have the turn coming around the corner and you can select one of the top tier premier players like a Jefferson, Chase, Christian McCaffrey, follow it up with a top 3 quarterback and go ahead and address another positional need in the third round immediately after. But when you go ahead and look at the different ADPs that have been demonstrated this offseason already, a lot of these overall concepts are far too early. I am not willing to go ahead and spend an early second round pick for Patrick Mahomes. I'm looking towards investing in a quarterback, specifically in the third round. And if I'm able to do so, that's where I want to go ahead and take advantage of it. But let's go ahead and give you an idea as to why people primarily want to go ahead and select a quarterback early anyway this season. It often has to do with the drop-off in production. Like we have demonstrated over the course of this season and in many other seasons, the drop-off in production gives you an understanding as to the number one ranked player all the way down to the lowest ranked player at that given position and how much fantasy points they score. Now, when we take the averages in terms of the drop-off in production from 2020 through 2022, the last 3 seasons, at the quarterback position in a 4-point per passing touchdown league, we see that the average QB1, which often has either been Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes, is averaging about 404 fantasy points in that given season. 100% of the capacity at which the quarterback position is functioning in a given year, or specifically in this case, over the course of the last 3 seasons on average. While you go to the 12th overall quarterback over the course of the last 3 seasons, only averaging about 273 fantasy points, which is about 68%, nearly 68% of the overall contribution of the QB1. Now, the primary reason why the quarterback position is seeing so much priority in these upcoming drafts that a lot of us are, of course, participating in, primarily has to do with the fact that one of these top 3 quarterbacks, if not all of them, all have the capability of being a 400-point fantasy quarterback based on the averages that they have produced. I mean, we go back to last season. Jalen Hurts averaged 25.2 fantasy points per game. Josh Allen, 24.7. Patrick Mahomes, 24.5. In order to be a 400-point fantasy point scoring quarterback in a given season, especially in a 17-game season, all you got to do is average over 23.5 fantasy points. Since 2020, Kyler Murray, Aaron Rodgers, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, and Jalen Hurts are the only quarterbacks to be able to accomplish that, averaging over 23.5 fantasy points in a given year. Of course, Patrick Mahomes has accomplished that twice, Jalen Hurts once, and Josh Allen 3 separate times. So that hopefully gives you a little bit of an understanding as to why I prioritize guys like Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes over Jalen Hurts, because they have the consistency of play. But when you have the ability to get a 400-point fantasy quarterback in comparison to drafting one of those third-round sketchy running backs or wide receivers that may have the ability to get into the RB1 conversation or wide receiver 1 conversation, but often are plateaued because of different variables and circumstances, it leads me to thinking, why wouldn't I want to go ahead and invest in an early quarterback? But if in fact the ADPs are very similar to what I presented before in regards to ESPN, Sleeper, Yahoo, or Underdog platforms, if in fact the quarterback position is coming off the board far too early, it's not worth it. You don't want to overdraft a specific position. Therefore, you would then just let the quarterback position go, continue to build depth at your running back, wide receiver, and tight end positions, and then come back for the quarterback position in the 4th or 5th rounds. Because over the course of the last 3 seasons, 2020 through 2022, we have seen 14 different quarterback performances surpass 350 fantasy points. That's 14 in the last 3 seasons. When you go ahead and compare that to 2004 through 2019, a 16-season span, throughout the 16 seasons, there were only 16 quarterback performances that surpassed 350 plus fantasy points in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. The evolution of the quarterback position, the consistency of mobile quarterbacks, not only being able to secure yardage on the ground with their legs, but be just as capable in terms of passing quarterback skills, has obviously elevated the quarterback position over the course of the last 3 seasons of fantasy football. And because of that, you don't have to tunnel in on one of these 3 major quarterbacks. You can wait for Lamar Jackson, Justin Fields in a round 4 scenario. You can wait for Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, or Trevor Lawrence in a round 5 scenario. These are the overall quarterbacks that you want to have on roster. Specifically, of course, the primary 3 that we mentioned with Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, and of course, Patrick Mahomes. But if you're not able to get them, it's these other 5 quarterbacks that you want to have on roster. And if you're going to let that position move, then of course you better be taking massive advantages at your other positions while prioritizing running back, wide receiver, and or tight end depth. Now, besides having the potential of a quarterback that could reach that 400 plus point fantasy performance, or in many circumstances, specifically over the last couple seasons, getting a quarterback that can score 350 or more fantasy points in a given year, besides the logic of having a higher scoring quarterback, when you look at a normal league where you have 1 starting quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 tight end, 1 flex, 1 kicker, and 1 defense, we're talking about 9 starting positions. So technically, one of those 9 specific players is considered to be 11% of the entire pie. But we all know that the quarterback position contributes far more, and the upside and consistency of upside that some of these dominant quarterbacks perform at in comparison to guys like if we talk about the QB 12 as of this current moment in time and the ADPs that we're finding them at, on ESPN, QB 12 is Aaron Rodgers in round 9. On Yahoo, it's Daniel Jones actually in round 8. In Sleeper, it's round 9 with Aaron Rodgers again. And then on Underdog, it's round 9 with Dak Prescott. So when we take into account the fact that you could have a 400 fantasy point quarterback or potentially 350 plus if the upside is there in rounds 3, 4, potentially 5, maybe even 6, if in fact we see Trevor Lawrence fall into that category. I've seen it before, but as of late doesn't really occur very often. If you can potentially have a quarterback from rounds 3 through 5 lock in and have that potential upside of success in comparison to waiting on quarterback until round 8 or 9 and still getting someone that is just barely going to break 300 fantasy points. I mean, there may honestly be a circumstance in which that doesn't even take place, which continues to solidify the idea that I want early quarterbacks. And we'll go ahead and go over different draft navigations as to which rounds I'm selecting which players at, why I'm selecting a quarterback in the 3rd, and how I'm going to build my roster around that position accordingly going forward because of that selection. I'll cover that at the end of today's video, but I want to continue on. I want to talk about other information that I've presented over the course of this offseason that I, of course, truly do believe is valuable in regards to the strength of schedule at the quarterback position. Going into 2023, again, many of you guys know how much I prioritize matchups in a given week and how much the 11 other defenders on the opposite side of the field certainly play an impact upon the fantasy values of our prospects. So at the quarterback position, when I take advantage of all of the information that was compiled last season in terms of how defenses played against opposing quarterbacks, and additionally giving ourselves an advantage by looking at the potential coverage grades of secondary members and linebackers over the course of last season, how they potentially are going to perform this upcoming year, we have a determination as to what the potential strength of schedule will look like for the 2023 season at the quarterback position. As you guys can see, the Indianapolis Colts ranked number 1. They would have the easiest strength of schedule in terms of averages going into the 2023 fantasy football season, while on the other end of the spectrum, the Washington Commanders, or the Washington football team, as I like to call them, would be considered to have the most difficult strength of schedule at the quarterback position. Use this information as you would like. Of course, I've gone ahead and displayed an entire video regarding strength of schedule at the quarterback position. So just in case you didn't see that video, you now have that information going into your upcoming drafts for this upcoming weekend. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about the running back position. Like I've mentioned before in the past, when we're talking about any sort of first round selection or even early round selection, it could even be in the top 24, top 36, it doesn't matter. The entire purpose of that selection is to ensure that you are selecting a player that is going to rank within the range in which you're selecting them. You want the fantasy points that is attributed to that player to be very similar to, hey, if I'm drafting a player in the first round, they better be a top 12 flex player, and they best be amongst one of the top 12 overall running backs, wide receivers, or tight ends in that given year. So if we go into the last 3 seasons of fantasy football, in terms of what we have been able to see in a half PPR scoring format, we've witnessed a top 12 flex distribution consisting of 17 running backs, 16 wide receivers, and 3 tight ends over the course of the last 3 seasons. Again, very similar distribution of this elite level of play at these 3 primary flex positions. Now, when we go ahead and even expand that further, when we talk about the top 24 flex positional players from 2020 through 2022, just going to go ahead and read this off for you guys. In the last 3 seasons, there have been 32 running backs, 35 wide receivers, and 5 tight ends, which on a per season average over the course of the last 3 seasons is about 11 running backs, 12 wide receivers, and 2 tight ends per top 24 flex selected. So typically, when I go ahead and visit some of these websites like Underdog, ESPN, Sleeper, or Yahoo, and just go ahead and look at what the current distribution and the volume at which these flex positions are being selected at, you go to Underdog. Currently, within the first 24 flex selections, not counting quarterbacks, 8 running backs, 15 wide receivers, 1 tight end. Certainly not similar to what we've been accustomed to over the course of the last 3 seasons of fantasy football. You go to ESPN, 9 running backs, 11 wide receivers, 1 tight end. Very similar. Sleeper with 10 running backs, 12 wide receivers, and 2 tight ends. Again, that is the identical distribution. Yahoo with 11 running backs, 12 wide receivers, and 1 tight end. Just barely off. Mark Andrews is just outside that overall spectrum. But ultimately, those are the numbers that we're probably looking at and thinking, yeah, that's probably how it's going to be. And if you can accurately draft and you can get prospects that are going to live up to their overall investment that you make upon them, and you can avoid injuries and all those different variables that are out of our control, then that is the way that you need to approach your upcoming draft in terms of not just tunneling hard on a wide receiver, but you want to just select players purely because they are going to be able to deliver for you. And again, even though we've seen the shift of this meta and a lot of wide receivers taking priority in draft this offseason, again, I want to go ahead and once again demonstrate the statistics on screen, primarily because when you compare the running back position and the wide receiver position and what we have seen over the course of the last 3 seasons in terms of running backs or wide receivers being able to repeat as either RB1s and wide receiver ones, and in the following year putting up similar top 12 potential, or potentially being an RB2 and staying consistent in that category, or being a first-time RB1 ever throughout an entire career. What are the likelihoods of these overall accounts based on the last 3 seasons? And ultimately, we've seen nearly just identical production, 16 running backs and 14 wide receivers in terms of a rate of return over the course of the last 3 years, while we also see a very similar rate in terms of wide receivers or running backs completely coming out of nowhere and being top 12 for the first time in their careers from 10 running backs and 12 wide receivers. Very similar production, yet we're seeing a lot of the early selections in our given drafts go towards the wide receiver position because many people are afraid of the running back position and what it has in store because of the volatility, the injuries, and all of that accounted. Now, we've already mentioned this offseason. I want to once again repeat it because it is extremely important to understand as to what the top 12 running back distribution looks like based on age. A lot of people look towards age and look towards injuries as potential variables that could lead us to a very terrible decision if in fact you're investing in a player like a Derrick Henry who is 29 years old, or a player like Aaron Jones who is getting up there in age, who has dealt with injuries. There are many arguments to be made in this regard, especially when we consider in the last 5 years of fantasy football, 85% of the RB1s have been contributed by players at the age of 22 through 26. Again, that is a huge determining factor as to what you may be wanting to look for this upcoming season when investing in running back. Again, you want to invest in specific younger players because you know that they don't have as much mileage, they don't have as many injuries, and they don't have as much risk kind of revolving around them. But again, when we take into account that the top 12 running backs for the last 5 years, 60 different running backs, 85% of them consisting of ages 22 through 26, when you take into account the volume of experience that we've seen, again, it is pretty much in that same range where we're talking about years 2 through 6 at the running back position being 85% of the overall top 12 contributions at the running back position. So pretty much we're looking for a specific type of running back, ages 22 through 26, who are given a boatload of opportunity and are going to be able to succeed with said opportunity. But what we witnessed last season often does scare people, but I really think it shouldn't. And I think we should continue to go after these running backs, despite the fact that last season, from ages 23 through 26, we saw the most injuries from running backs. Now, of the current distribution of running backs, the 34 that are on screen, 8, 16, 9, and 1. Those 34 running backs were the first 34 running backs taken off draft boards during the 2022 fantasy football drafts of last season based on ADP. So when we go ahead and take into account the fact that all of the younger players significantly had to deal with, brutal injuries and miss significant time, that is an impact that is certainly going to play a factor in my mind, especially considering we want to invest in those players. We want to make sure that we hit and invest correctly because 85% of the top 12 over the course of the last 5 seasons has come from that age range. So typically we want to be careful, but understand that when you go ahead and look at age as one of those variables, looking specifically at last season, of the 9 running backs who played at the ages of 27 through 29 last year, only missing 9 games overall. That's only 9% of the games overall missed. That is a significant factor when investing in some of those older running backs like a Nick Chubb or a Derrick Henry that going into this upcoming year can once again put together incredible production and lead us to success, despite the fact that there may not be within that age group that has proven to find a lot of success over the last couple of years. There are always going to be outliers and there are always going to be legends at the position that could absolutely be able to contribute for us within a given season. And when I mention these kind of legends like a Derrick Henry or potentially a Nick Chubb, we're talking about players that are pretty much been extinct. Players that are getting so many rushing attempts and touches within this backfield, we very rarely ever see that anymore. I mean, the evolution of the game at the running back position, primarily when we look at 2003 all the way to 2012 in comparison to 2013 through 2022, the last decade of fantasy football, there's been a, ginormous drop-off in terms of overall opportunity, touches, and contributions to these running backs in comparison. In fantasy football is a lot more about the potential of receiving upside leading to fantasy success, or potentially the idea of, hey, do we want to give, a multitude of running backs a different rotation or committee a bunch of touches so we can keep everyone healthy? That begins to shift everything in terms of what we as fantasy managers have to approach with and how we have to prioritize these upper tier running backs who are still given elite levels of opportunity. Because when you look at the last 5 seasons of fantasy football, as I've demonstrated, there have been 277 running back performances in a given year that have been able to surpass a total of 9 to 11 opportunities per game or more over the course of the last 5 seasons. Again, 277 total. Now, when we take into account these ranges, 9 to 11 opportunities, 12 to 14, all the way up to 22 to 30, the pure sweet spot is typically 21 opportunities per game, which often leads to 20 touches per game, which leads to a workhorse running back, which often is, again, 262 plus fantasy points per season, which is exactly what we want from first and second round running backs, if not more fantasy points, which of course we know many of them have the capabilities of getting to that 300 point mark, similar to an Austin Eckler, Christian McCaffrey last year, and many other running backs in seasons past. But we just purely want players that are given high levels of opportunity. If that player is going to be an older running back, so be it. I need to go ahead and roster players that are quite literally extinct in the entire fantasy landscape, because very seldom do we ever see teams give running backs like Derrick Henry the ball 30 plus times, because a lot of other teams don't have running backs built like him and aren't going to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. So hopefully I've broadened your vision in regards to the type of running backs that we're looking for, guys that we want to invest in, because we know what they're potentially capable of accomplishing during the 2023 season. And again, there aren't many of them left going into a given year, so we want to take advantage of it. Now, besides all the fantasy points that we've kind of demonstrated on screen in terms of a 17-game season, the amount of opportunities, touches, fantasy points per game, all of that kind of jazz, you have to understand that every single opportunity a running back is given has a designated value. Some opportunities lead to -8 yards in the backfield. Some opportunities lead to a 99-yard rushing touchdown, or some opportunities may end up being a receiving target that leads to an 11-yard reception down the field. There are different types of opportunities in fantasy football. They are not created equally. Some opportunities could be on the 1-yard line, could punch it in for 6 fantasy points, and all of a sudden you have Jamal Williams from last year who is benefiting from the fact that a lot of his opportunities, but despite the fact that he isn't an efficient running back, are some of the most valuable fantasy opportunities that you can have at the running back position. And when we go ahead and we isolate statistics as such, valuable opportunities specifically down in the red zone, specifically when we look at the last 3 seasons, 2020 through 2022, all 3 of those seasons had 12 running backs that were within the RB1 range. Of those 36 running backs, 30 of them consisted of players that were from teams that were in the top 18 in terms of rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line within their given year of helping that running back become a top 12 player. So if you've been an RB1 as of late, chances are you've been from a team that rushes the ball a bunch of times down in the red zone, specifically on the 5-yard line and in. Now, when we go ahead and distribute these teams in terms of 3 out of 3, 2 out of 3, and 1 out of 3, that's the amount of times that these teams have been able to accomplish that feat over the course of the last 3 seasons, seeing the Rams, Vikings, Titans, Colts, Commanders, and of course the Cleveland Browns all accomplishing this number 3 out of the last 3 seasons, which certainly gives us more upside in the potential of a Derrick Henry, a Nick Chubb, like I've been mentioning. Guys that, again, are going to get elite levels of opportunity, players who are going to contribute high levels of fantasy production, and of course should be coming off of draft boards relatively early. Now, when we see the Colts there, Frank Wright, their head coach and offensive play caller over the course of the last 3 seasons, is no longer there. He's on the Carolina Panthers, so that could shift that. You have Kevin O'Connell, who's taken over the Minnesota Vikings. He continued that streak going into this year. Sean McVay's been with the Rams this entire time. There are going to be scenarios similar to, the 49ers, the Eagles, the Kansas City Chiefs, the Giants. When we look at the running backs associated with these teams, Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, Aaron Jones, David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs, Austin Eckler. These are elite level running backs. Tony Pollard, Bijan Robinson. There are running backs associated with these teams in the 2 out of 3 category that, again, is in the sweet spot, those running backs that we want to have on roster because we know the opportunity is going to be there. And then most recently, we have the Jaguars and Bengals, who have only been able to accomplish this feat of being in the top 18 in terms of rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line in just 2022. But again, it's promising considering Doug Peterson's a new head coach within that organization. Of course, Joe Mixon, once again, will have himself a full workload of opportunity this year. And if the opportunities are certainly going to be there inside the 5-yard line, his fantasy production should follow. So when we kind of look at the entire position as a whole, and then we take into account the variable of potentially the running back position having a strength of schedule as such going into 2023, the Minnesota Vikings having the easiest strength of schedule at the running back position, while the Philadelphia Eagles has the most difficult strength of schedule at the position, it does give you guys more and more insight as to, okay, the Minnesota Vikings, Alexander Mattison, if there's no other running backs competing with him on touches, not only is he in an offense that has ran the ball a bunch of times in the red zone, not only is he going to take majority of the workload that Dalvin Cook is now leaving absent, he's also going to be in an offense that has an extremely easy strength of schedule, be at a pretty solid offensive line for all intents and purposes in terms of run blocking. All in all, hopefully all of this information just gives you more potential ammo so that when you're making decisions for your 2023 fantasy football drafts, you're building the best overall roster as we approach. Now, when we go ahead and talk about the wide receiver position, similar to the running back position, when I talked about, hey, if you're going to make a selection for a wide receiver early or in the first 2 rounds, they've got to be able to live up to that overall expectation. If you're going to go back-to-back on wide receivers in the first 2 rounds and you're going to neglect the running back position early, then you have to do so wisely based on the amount of success we have seen from the wide receiver position over the course of the last 3 seasons. In specific, in terms of averages, of the 16 wide receivers, like we mentioned earlier, that have been top 12 flex players in the last 3 years, 75% of them, 12 out of 16, come from teams that were ranked within the top 12 in wide receiver targets. 75% of them ranked in top 12 in wide receiver receptions, 100% of them ranked in top 12 in terms of wide receiver receiving yards, 94% in top 12 in terms of wide receiver receiving touchdowns throughout the last 3 years on average. And of course, when you look at teams that have been able to accomplish all 4 of those categories in the top 12 for the last 3 consecutive years, we're talking about the Bills, the Bengals, the Cowboys, the Chargers, the Rams, the Vikings, and the Buccaneers. All the teams that are displayed on screen. When we're looking at the wide receivers that have come from those offenses, specifically Stephon Diggs, Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb. I know that last season, Keenan Allen and Mike Williams were injured, but hey, they've had themselves a lot of fantasy success over the course of the last couple seasons. Rams wide receivers, I know Cooper Kupp was hurt last year, but in 2021 was, of course, the best wide receiver in fantasy football. Justin Jefferson for the Vikings, and of course, with Tom Brady, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin have always been in that wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1 conversation over the course of the last 3 consecutive years. Now, when we take an even further step, and when we talk about the quarterback play that helps our wide receivers achieve higher overall standing, when we look at those 16 overall wide receivers that have, again, been in the top 12 flex over the course of the last 3 seasons, 14 of those 16 overall wide receivers, 88% of them, come from teams that were in the top 16 in quarterback passing yards in a given year. When we go ahead and look at all those teams that were capable of doing so, on average, over the course of the last 3 seasons, we're talking about the Bills, Bengals, Cowboys, Rams, Vikings, Chargers, Buccaneers, Chiefs, and 49ers. Again, a lot of the same wide receivers that we mentioned in this conversation, because majority of the formula in order to find success here has a lot to do with opportunity and, of course, a lot of volume from those quarterbacks throwing the ball across the field. Now, similar to the way that I mentioned the running back position earlier in regards to the opportunities that running backs got within the red zone and how those teams kind of distributed their overall success in that regard over the course of the last 3 seasons. When we look at the wide receiver position and which teams have really, as of late, been able to not only clear the top 12 in terms of those receiving statistics, but also the top 16 in terms of those passing yardage numbers, we see the Arizona Cardinals have been able to successfully do it for multiple years. But again, Cliff Kingsbury's gone, Kyler's injured, and DeAndre Hopkins is gone. So pretty much they're out of the equation. The Detroit Lions have been able to accomplish only in 2020 all the wide receiver statistics, but on the other end, the quarterback passing statistics, 2 out of the last 3 seasons. Pretty promising for Amon-Ra St. Brown. The Jacksonville Jaguars have been able to very consistently put up those numbers from 2020 through 2022 in terms of all the wide receiver statistics. And also last season, Trevor Lawrence, the passing yardage was there. Of course, that bodes very well for guys like Calvin Ridley. We talk about the Las Vegas Raiders. They've been able to produce all of those numbers consistently over the course of the last couple of years. That bodes very well, hopefully, for Devontae Adams. The Miami Dolphins have been able to consistently produce that. The Philadelphia Eagles have been able to consistently produce that in 2022. And of course, the Seattle Seahawks are also in that conversation. So even when we're not mentioning and putting up a graphic for all those different teams, the Lions, the Jaguars, the Raiders, the Miami Dolphins, the Philadelphia Eagles, and the Seattle Seahawks all have potential of creating a top 12 flex fantasy wide receiver based on their history of success in these given categories. And going into this upcoming year, again, we already know guys like Calvin Ridley, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, AJ Brown, Devonta Smith, DK Metcalf are all already in the conversation of being a top tier wide receiver. And that's the guys that we want to select. Now, when we go into the future rounds and we look at the wide receiver position, we still want to get wide receivers that are associated with high levels of opportunity, but you're not going to always find that. You'll find guys like Amari Cooper that are able to produce incredible numbers, even in bad circumstances. You'll be able to find a running back that, despite the fact that his team doesn't give him the ball on the 5-yard line very often, the opportunities that they do give him still leads to fantasy points, and he can still be relevant in a given year. There are always going to be outliers, but in the broad majority, when we're looking at 90% or even 88% success rates, this is the numbers and these are the metrics we want to follow when addressing the specific positional needs that we kind of require for our teams to have a strong base of production and pillars that can very easily lead us to our Week 17 Fantasy Football Championship. The final thing I wanted to show for the wide receiver position is the strength of schedule. Again, we've gone ahead and presented this already this season. The New Orleans Saints have the easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position, followed by the Green Bay Packers and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That bodes very well for Chris Olave, Christian Watson, Chris Godwin. Again, that's a lot of Chris's at the top of the conversation, but on the other end, we have Stephon Diggs, the Buffalo Bills with the toughest strength of schedule, but nonetheless, with opportunity, of course, leading the way. Again, like I always mention, opportunity leads to success in fantasy football, and that will not be shy of the potential scoreline of what Stephon Diggs is able to present this year despite the difficulty of his upcoming schedule. Okay, let's move on to the tight end position before we close out today's video. Again, like I've mentioned in the past, the tight end position is important, and I often like to prioritize selecting a tight end that at least is in the top 5 of that conversation within my given rankings. But I do want to mention the ebbs and flows of this position and the fact that it has been one of the most volatile over the course of the last decade of fantasy football, much less the last 5 years, it's just been putrid. As of the last specific 2 seasons of fantasy football, as you guys can see, I've demonstrated it on screen, there have been just as many fantasy football kickers and defenses that have surpassed 150 fantasy points. Then there have been tight ends that have surpassed 150 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. I mean, the fact of the matter is, last season, Mark Andrews, who often was a second-round selection, scored less points than Justin Tucker, the kicker on his own team. Hopefully that gives you just an understanding as to what kind of volatility I'm talking about. This is a commentary not only on the tight end position, but the value of efficient and high-level kickers and defenses that are just as valuable at the tight end position. So what I want to go ahead and convey in terms of this point, unless you're going to invest in a Travis Kelce or a Mark Andrews, and we truly do believe that they're both going to produce at high levels, or even guys like TJ Hawkinson, Darren Waller, and or George Kittle, guys that we know and have produced at high levels of consistency over the course of the last couple of years, unless you're going to invest in those overall tight ends and you're going to find success and positional advantages there, my suggestion would be to ignore the position and wait until very later rounds 8 and beyond, in order to address the position, because over the course of the last 5 seasons, we have seen tight ends who have been first-time tight ends in their entire careers appear out of nowhere consistently. Going back to 2018, of course, at the very bottom right of the graphic, George Kittle, Austin Hooper, Trey Burton, David Njoku, and Vance McDonald, all in 2018, were tight end ones for the first times in their career. You go to the following year, Darren Waller, Mark Andrews, Tyler Higbee, Hunter Henry, Dallas Goedert, Mike Gesicki all came out of the woodwork as the tight end position, specifically players that were coming off of waiver wire claims, were leading the overall pack and continuing to find success. You go to 2020, another waiver wire darling like Robert Tonyan and Logan Thomas. We go to 2021, we talk about guys like Dalton Schultz and Dawson Knox, who were often available on waivers even last season. Taysom Hill, Cole Kmet, and Jawan Johnson, players that, quite frankly, benefited from touchdowns, of course, but came out of nowhere and weren't on many of our rosters after draft day, but they don't have to be, because you can find value at the tight end position, a position that, again, is so highly predicated on touchdowns leading to success. Last season in specific, from weeks 1 through 18, 65% of the top 12 tight end performances in a given week consisted of at least 1 receiving touchdown. That's 8 out of every 12 tight ends having at least 1 receiving touchdown in a given week of top 12 production. That makes it extremely difficult if your tight ends are not seeing a lot of red zone opportunity, especially if, in fact, they have to rely upon yardage and receptions to be able to even compete with the rest of the tight end position. We're talking about the base minimum of ranking as the number 12 overall tight end in fantasy football last season without scoring a touchdown. At a base minimum, you need 4 receptions and 51 receiving yards on average. Otherwise, if you just want to rank amongst the top 12 anywhere, typically on average, it took about 73 receiving yards last season, which again is very rare to find at the tight end position, especially when we're not talking about the elite players that are getting the high volume of targets. So to highlight it once again, unless you're going to invest heavily in a tight end, ignore the position altogether, wait for the later round guys like a Tyler Higbee, invest that way, and avoid any sort of volatility that could come to fruition with those middle round guys that we truly cannot trust outright, in comparison to even guys like kickers and defenses that produce more points than them on a given weekly basis that you can draft many rounds later, that again, on a 9 starting roster team with 1 quarterback, 1 tight end, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a flex, a kicker, and a defense, that tight end and kicker position are just as valuable as one another when contributing in a given week, especially when they have just as much upside. All right, let's go ahead. Let's talk about, of course, the tight end strength of schedule. I did not produce a video on this offseason, but I wanted to go ahead and present it in regards to, of course, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Arizona Cardinals, Detroit Lions. Sam Laporta obviously will have himself a little bit of fun, but in terms of the overall strength of schedule, there isn't a specific team that has such a significantly stronger schedule than the rest of the pack to make me feel super confident about any of these guys at the top of the conversation. I guess Chigoziem Okonkwo will, play a little bit better because of the ease of schedule, similar to Darren Waller in comparison to the Buffalo Bills and or Washington Commanders tight ends. But ultimately, these are going to change as players get injured over the course of the year. Everything's going to fluctuate, but nonetheless, just kind of giving you guys a little bit of a broad spectrum as to what we're anticipating in terms of strength of schedule going into this year. The final thing I wanted to mention before we close out today's video is in regards to the draft kind of navigating strategies that I've conducted and I find a lot of success with. If in fact you're going to take a quarterback in the 3rd round, if he is available, again, like I mentioned, I do not want a quarterback in the 2nd round unless that player is on the 1-2 turn. And at that point, they could potentially end up being a 3rd round selection if it falls to you. At that given point, starting with, whether it is RB or wide receiver doesn't really matter. I'm just leaving this up to whatever interpretation I kind of originally felt was compelling. If I'm going to start with a 3rd round quarterback selection, it's typically because I'm starting wide receiver early with one of those top 4 wide receivers early in my draft, selecting a running back in the 2nd, taking a quarterback in the 3rd, addressing wide receiver once again in the 4th, taking a tight end, again, one of those top tier guys, if in fact available, Hawkinson, Waller, Kittle, and then addressing the running back position once again in that 6th round for a player that is often slept on. Perhaps guys like Alexander Madison, Miles Sanders, etc. Players that have high upside, that are in offenses that are going to give them a boatload of opportunity. And as we've mentioned, opportunity leads to success in fantasy football. If I'm looking at a 4th round quarterback selection, because again, it is important to have an elite quarterback on roster, whether it is selecting Justin Fields or Lamar Jackson in the 4th round. Again, the distribution of what you end up selecting in the first 3 rounds is irrelevant. It's just a matter of what you're going to build around this quarterback. I started off with like a running back, wide receiver, quarterback combo. Then I went ahead and I addressed once again that overall tight end position to take the positional advantage there. And then I kept it with a very similar, I guess, hero running back strategy to where I'm selecting one running back early and then I'm selecting another one way later down the line. Now, if you want to go ahead and ignore quarterback and let it go to the 5th and get Herbert, Joe Burrow, potentially Trevor Lawrence if available in those circumstances, you would then, in my mind, just punt on the tight end position. Because if you're going to wait at quarterback, there is so much value to be had at wide receiver and tight end. You could end up grabbing, Mark Andrews in the 3rd or, a tight end like Travis Kelce in the 1st. But oftentimes when I'm building a team where I wait on quarterback and I also early invest in the tight end, I don't really end up loving the composition of my team overall. So typically I would say if you're going for that 5th round quarterback or even beyond, you end up punting on that tight end. Now, if you're going for that, hey, I'm going to draft my quarterback in the 8th round, then at that point, yes, I do believe you need to invest in the tight end position far earlier because, again, you need the positional advantage while you are, of course, prioritizing wide receiver, running back. You need to also prioritize tight end because of the disadvantage you're going to have at the quarterback position going into the given year. Okay, that covers it for me today. Hopefully, again, I threw a lot of information. I talked pretty fast. Hopefully, all this information can be just absorbed by you and utilize this upcoming weekend for your upcoming drafts. Again, if you guys want more details, more information on my methodology as to how I approach drafts, be sure to go ahead, travel down to the description of the video, check out Underdog Fantasy, get a hold of my 2023 fantasy football draft guide and rankings that will be updated this upcoming Saturday morning at 5 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. That email will be sent directly to you, so be sure to check your spam folder. Again, all you got to do is use code Andrew, make that first time deposit minimum of $10, sign up today, get the rankings, get the draft guide, and get the rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the 2023 season so we can help you capture a fantasy football championship. That's going to cover it for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.